Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. As many of you know, I posted a community post today talking about the, first the Netflix documentary, Betty Brodericks. I know it gets confusing on Netflix. I know it says Dirty John and then it's like parentheses or something, and then it says Betty Brodericks. Dirty John was another series attached to that show. It doesn't have anything to do with the Broderick case. It's just two different cases in that one series. But anyway, so I'm talking about the Betty Brodericks Netflix series, and this is actually how I first found out about the Broderick case. It's a couple. They were from the East Coast. I know Betty grew up in New York, and Dan, I believe, in Pennsylvania, and they met at a Notre Dame game in Indiana, I believe. So when they met, they immediately, I think, exchanged, back then they didn't have phones or anything, but they exchanged addresses and they would write to each other, and they basically courted each other because they were both Catholic, and Betty, more so, she went to like all girls schools, and she was raised, in a house basically where they raised their daughters to not worry so much about education, but to find a rich man and marry him. And they were very strict. And so Betty was a virgin. And I'm going to do like a couple videos about this case where I'll go a little more in depth. But for you guys who have seen the Netflix documentary, you'll know that the driving force for Betty to kill Dan and Linda, which Linda was his wife at the time that Betty killed both of them, she was first Dan's assistant, and then they ended up having an affair. And then Betty ultimately killed Dan. Now, Betty's reasoning has always been because Dan ruined her life and the children. And she says that Dan took the children from her, wouldn't let her see them, and wouldn't give her a fair settlement. Now, Dan was not only a lawyer, a high-priced lawyer in Southern California. It was the La Jolla area of San Diego, very, really rich area out there. Not only was he a lawyer, he was also an MD. He had went to medical school first. So he was a medical malpractice lawyer, which he sued doctors for malpractice. And Betty claims that, during their early marriage, she worked odd jobs and basically put him through school. So she was entitled to at least half of everything. And at the time of their divorce, Dan was worth, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so when they first separated, Dan was voluntarily giving her $9,000 a month. And Betty didn't think that was enough, so she went to court and they raised it to $16,000 a month. But Dan ultimately had full custody of the children because Betty dropped all 4 kids off at Dan's place when Dan had moved out. Betty didn't want him being a bachelor and have no responsibilities, so she dropped the kids off at Dan's house and she left back east, back to New York for her father's birthday party or something. And Dan wasn't even home, so Dan got pissed. And he ended up filing like a motion to get, full custody of the children. Betty thought that if she dropped all the children off at Dan's house, that he would regret leaving Betty because it's so hard to raise the children on your own, and he would come crawling back. But, Dan had a bunch of money, so he just ended up hiring nannies and housekeepers, and that didn't work. So Betty was even more mad and started leaving, harassing voice messages and, destroying his house. So the videos that I finally found online, because I couldn't find many court videos on YouTube. And the reason I was seeking out court videos is because I know that the second trial of Betty's was televised. But before that, so I got really engrossed into the Netflix series. So I ended up buying 2 books, and on the case. One was Forsaking All Others, and then the other one was one that Betty wrote, the 12th of November, or it was she helped write that book or whatever. I might even be wrong about that, but I'll post pictures of the books that I bought. And so I've been really, engrossed in this. Like, it's so interesting because in the Netflix documentary, the lady that plays Betty looks nothing like Betty, but not only that, they made Betty out to be a victim. And of course, Dan had the affair, and maybe he was, a little hard at times on Betty. But once I found these videos of the trial, I'm like, oh my gosh, like Betty definitely cared more about the money and the divorce settlement than her own children. She wouldn't even see her kids until Dan promised her at least $1 million. And like $25,000 a month in alimony. She was getting 16. She didn't think that was enough. I know Dan made a lot of money, but Betty just would not take custody of the kids or any responsibility for them until she got a settlement. And once she got the settlement and she didn't get the $1 million and the $25,000 a month alimony, she went and killed Dan and Linda. She didn't care that she left her kids basically orphans. Dad's dead, mom's in prison for the rest of her life. She still to this day has no remorse for what she did. So that's what made me search out for these trial videos. And so the clips that I put together was from her second trial in 1991. And the prosecution is basically calling her out as to why she claims that Dan was keeping her from the children, but in fact, that wasn't the case. And she says that she didn't have money to take them on the trips that they deserved, but she was out spending, thousands of dollars at Neiman Marcus and Saks and all these places, but claimed that she didn't have enough money to give her children the life they deserved. So take a look.
Mr. Broderick's ex-wife. I didn't know who I was in the world. I didn't know where I stood. I didn't know his name was still on the house, so I wasn't secure that that was my house. I had no definition.
You did say social standing.
I said social standing. I meant identity.
That she should be allowed, when there's a question, when they're asked, what did you mean, she should be allowed to explain what she meant.
Objection sustained. Let her finish her answer, Mrs. Wells, and you can ask her another question.
Did you finish the answer?
No, it's a pretty complicated answer. I didn't know who I was. I had lost my social friends through Dan and the legal system.
I'm sorry. I'm listening.
I had a total lack of identity, and this financial settlement to me would have been day one of building a new Betty Broderick. But I didn't know how to build a new Betty Broderick until I got the definition of who I was and where I was going to live and how I was going to work. And that's what I meant by that. It wasn't social stand.
It was your choice to wait and make sure about your claims of financial security before you took custody of the children.
At several junctures, I said I wouldn't take the children. Never was I, in fact, offered the children. Never.
You never made a request for the children. You specifically did not make a request for the children. For example, when you were represented by Mr. Hargraves in 1986, did you?
Mr. Hargreaves, as we've described, was on the job for one court appearance. We never got to discussing the kids.
And that was a court appearance where you could go in and you could request custody of the kids. In fact, he talked to you about the fact that if you took custody of the kids, you'd even get more money. But you didn't even want to do that.
No, that's not correct. We went in on an emergency support order because of being denied any money in November of '86 and December of '86. Dan had cut it off entirely. There's a legal word for what it was, how he had an emergency hearing. That covered no other subjects about community property or children or visitation, not even mentioned. That was strictly emergency support here.
And it was your choice to have Mr. Hargraves then go in for this emergency support as opposed to going in and also asking for custody. There was nothing that prevented him from doing that.
Not as opposed to.
Sustained.
You never made a request of Mr. Hargraves to make a motion for custody, correct?
Mr. Hargraves wasn't on the job long enough. He did the emergency support hearing, and he was fired.
Yes or no? Did you ever make a request of Mr. Hargraves for custody of the children?
No.
And in fact, when you went up and hired Mr. Glucksman in Los Angeles, he went ahead and he wrote up a whole motion for custody of the children and filed it, and you were angry about that. You complained about it with Mr. Hargraves, that you had no intention of seeking custody of the kids, and you were angry that Mr. Glucksman had done that.
No, what happened with that was Mr. Glucksman was on the job again for a little short period of time, and he started the works to get the whole divorce done. He was going to start discovery. He listed depositions to be taken, and we were going to go to court for the kids and things. And then Tricia Smith came along, and all the dates that Mr. Glucksman put on were vacated. And then Tricia Smith started doing things her way. And
May I simply ask you whether or not you complained to Mr. Hargraves about the fact that Mr. Glucksman
No.
had filed a motion for custody without your permission?
no,
You never did
that's
that?
not true.
Well, moving into 1987, with respect to custody of the children, you had the meetings in March with Dr. Roth. And it was very clear at that time, again, that you did not want custody of the children when you had your meetings with Dr. Roth, correct?
I was a total wreck by the time I met Dr. Roth, and I could not take the children emotionally at all. Until I got a settlement, I was frantic. I'd been thrown in jail. I'd gone through all this stuff. He'd cut off all the money. I'd gone through the Glucksman, Hargreaves, Tricia Smith thing. I had liens on my house. I'd given away my necklace. And I was absolutely, when I met Ruth Roth. Sorry, how you transcribe that, sorry.
When you met Ruth Roth, it was made clear to you that the issue was custody of the children and trying to do something to settle that for the children, and that you had the option of taking the children at that point, and you said no. You said there was no way you would be the single mother of 4 children. Whether you have your reasons for it or not, isn't it true that you made the choice at that time not to take the children?
Your Honor,
That is
objection.
misstated.
The question is compound.
Overruled. Let me answer that.
Did you indicate to Dr. Roth that there was no way you were going to be the single mother of 4 children?
Dr. Roth never offered me the children. She was not in a position to say, here are your kids, Betty, go home now.
Did you
It was
make
a
the
discussion.
statement to Dr. Roth that you were not going to be the single mother of 4 children? That Dan Broderick would die first?
I don't remember making that exact statement. I was an absolute basket case. I was terrified. I was horrified. I was scared. I was upset. The whole Dr. Ruth Roth little segment was a disaster. Every part of it was a disaster.
And, well, let's move on to December of '87. That was in March of '87. In December of '87, again, Dan Broderick had made an offer, tried to make an offer to you to take the children, and again, you refused in December of 1987.
Could you just get a little bit more specific, please?
And did you write in your diary in December of 1987, Dan has new tact of giving me kids. Trouble is, my house does not fit them, and I have no money to support them.
If that's what I wrote in the diary, that's what I wrote in the diary. But I don't remember that particular Christmas or why, or I'm not with you yet on what was going on at that time.
If you could just take a look at this diary sheet and just identify if that's your handwriting, please.
Yes, it's a sheet of the diary. If I could see the rest of the diary, the sheets before, I would know how we got there.
Okay, but you did say in December of 1987 that Dan was trying to give you the kids. But the trouble was your house did not fit them and you had no money to support them. You made that statement.
If that's what that says, yes.
Weren't-
But it's
weren't-
out of context.
Weren't you complaining at that time that it was Dan's house that didn't fit the kids? That it was Dan's house that was in the slums and it wasn't an appropriate house and that your house was much better? Weren't you making statements like that?
We came out of a 5-bedroom house where every child had their own bedroom and we had a master bedroom. That's 5 bedrooms. And each of us after Coral Reef got 3-bedroom houses, which put a master bedroom and a suite and then 2 other bedrooms sharing a bath. So that left the 2 boys in one room, the 2 girls in another room, and all 4 children sharing what was in both houses, a very small bath. 4 kids sharing the one bath. That is not the living arrangements any of us were ever used to, and the kids sharing the closet and everything in the room.
So was that your reason for not taking the children in 1987?
No, but
Because
that's the
they have to
reason for
share a
that.
room?
That's the reason for that, and that's before I built the family room and tried to make my house better for the children. Neither Dan's house nor my house had a family room or enough bedrooms compared to Coral Reef.
Well, so the children had to share a room at Dan's house, right? Danny and Rhett stayed in the same room. They had bunk beds in the same room at Dan's house, right?
Only for a few months because they fought like crazy. And then when somebody moved out, Danny went into that bedroom, and Kim was in the maid's room downstairs, and that's how Lee ended up in the pool house.
Okay.
You know,
And
'cause
so
they're-
are you saying there was no room in that house that you were living in to take these children?
No, everything's relative. I could have had 100 people on the floor if that's how they wanted to live, but it wasn't the
You're-
way they were used to living.
Okay.
And I was trying to make the house better for them.
And so your choice in December of 1987 was still that the house was not appropriate enough to take custody of your children.
If that's what that says, that's what I wrote there that day at that time for a reason. I had to
You
fix up
also
my
said-
house. I added things as time went on.
Okay. It was more important to you to fix up your house.
It was more important to me that the
That's
kids...
argumentative, Rob.
Sustained.
And it was November of, well, let's just have this identified. People's 80 Your Honor, check written to Elizabeth Broderick, dated November 13th, 1986.
So marked.
Is that the check that you received for $10,000?
I guess. It's one of them, yeah.
Well, is that a check that was written to you from Dan Broderick, and is it endorsed on the back by yourself?
Right. And it says community property distribution on the bottom.
Yeah, and what do you write on the check?
No way, AH,
And what does AH mean?
asshole.
You wrote little notes like that on all the checks that Dan Broderick sent
Only
to you,
when I
didn't
thought
you?
I was being cheated like this, yes.
Well,
I got cheated out of $20,000 in one day with Mr. Hargreaves, and it was a huge mistake. Dan Broderick was not supposed to be paying my support with community property. Those are two separate things.
you complained to Mr. Hargraves that you didn't have any money to live off of in October, November, December of January 1986, and that's why you needed some money. You needed the $10,000 or any money from Dan Broderick, correct?
Yeah, and it's Christmas time again, too. This always pops up in November.
And you didn't have enough money that year to take the children for Christmas because you didn't have enough money to go skiing, correct?
The children went skiing every year at Christmas. Dan took them the previous year, so I thought I'd take them this year. Plane tickets, lift tickets, hotel rooms, etc. cost a lot of money. Dan said he'd give me the money to pay for a ski trip. I made the reservations in Utah, just like where he went in '85. I made the reservations, and then when he went to give me the money for the ski trip, he sent $2,000. And
Which
I
is
said,
what you had agreed on. You had
oh,
agreed
no.
on $2,000.
$2,000 wouldn't even get us on the plane, much less lift tickets and a hotel and everything.
So you
for a
wanted to
week.
go on a ski trip. In order to take the children for Christmas of that year, you wanted to go on a ski trip, and you had to have Dan Broderick pay you more money because $2,000 wasn't enough to do it.
No, that's not really it. The kids want to go on a ski trip. And if they came with me, they could go on a ski trip if I had enough money. If I didn't have enough money, they should stay with him and go on a ski trip.
Okay.
It's their only time of the year they can go.
You refused to take them for that Christmas because you claimed you didn't have enough money to take them on the ski trip.
I couldn't afford that much money out of the budget that I had at that time. I couldn't afford over $10,000 for a week of skiing.
Your Honor, may I have marked as People's Exhibit 81?
I don't remember particularly that conversation. Danny was also threatening to run away and commit suicide.
And did that have anything to do with the fact that you were telling him to do things like pour boiling hot water on Linda's?
No, none of those things ever happened, that little group you're working on there.
Did it have anything to do with
Nobody.
telling him that they had to do bad and mean and cruel and vicious and violent things to Linda before they could come visit you?
No, I told them they did not have to do what she told them. She was only a live-in office girl at the time. She was not engaged or married or anything, and she had no right bossing my kids around and making them cry. And they called her a bitch. They didn't like her. They hated her. And I said, you don't have to do what she says. She does not have to order you around.
When Danny was going to see Ruth Roth, was he telling Ruth Roth about the things that you were telling him to do to Linda?
I don't know.
Well, that Easter, that you talked about an Easter where a visitation was canceled at the last minute. It wasn't canceled by Dan Broderick, was it? It was canceled by Ruth Roth, who was seeing Danny at the time,
No
correct?
objection, that calls for conclusion.
Sustained.
Well, were you advised that it was canceled by Ruth Roth?
Your Honor, objection, that calls for hearsay.
No, overruled on that ground. Were you advised of that?
No, what I knew is when I arrived at school...
That's enough. You answered the
Oh.
question.
Isn't it true that Tricia Smith had called you before you even went to school and told you that Ruth Roth had advised against the visitation?
I don't remember if Tricia called me, but when I got to school and Dan was pulling away, Dan told the children that I changed my mind. He didn't mention Ruth Roth.
How do you know what Dan told the children?
Because they called and told me that Dan said that I changed my mind about that week, and I said I didn't change my mind.
Before you went to pick them up, though, hadn't you been advised by Tricia Smith that Ruth Roth was the one that was calling off the visitation?
I don't remember. I just went to pick the kids up like I was supposed to pick them up, and I don't remember. All I know is Dan told the kids that I changed my mind, and that was wrong. I did not change my mind. And the boys were very crying and upset that I changed my mind, and I didn't.
You were aware at some point that it was Ruth Roth
Yes, later.
who canceled that visitation. It was not Dan. And it was based on what she was hearing from Danny at the time.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. It calls for assumes facts, not evidence.
Well, it's sustained on the basis been asked and answered. She said she doesn't recall Tricia Smith telling her that.
No, I'm asking about at any point after the fact, you became aware that it was Ruth Roth,
Your Honor.
not Dan Broderick that canceled it.
Okay,
Your Honor,
well,
I object. It assumes facts, not evidence, and she knows.
No, it's overruled. Did you ever become aware of that, just yes or no?
Ruth Roth was not...
Just yes or no, Mrs.
What's the
Broderick?
question again?
Did you ever become aware that it was Ruth Roth who canceled the visitation and not Dan Broderick?
Ruth Roth could not cancel my visitation. Dan had to cancel it. It was her
Did you
recommendation.
become aware that Ruth Roth was the one that recommended that it be canceled?
Much later, but to me it was Dan that did it. Because ultimately it was always Dan.
You did, you've acknowledged leaving some messages on the phone answering machine at Dan Broderick's house.
Thousands and thousands, yes.
And you did it intentionally to harass him.
Not the thousands and thousands of messages, no. Some of them.
Well, let's, for example.
Oh no, you again. All you know about clean anyway, the mere existence is a filthy statement on human life. You're like the scum of the earth. People like you are not new, you know. They've been around since the beginning of the same old story. Yeah. I wonder when my kids are coming home. Oh well. Call back later, I guess. Just to harass you.
For the record, what exhibit was that she played from?
That's a good question.
It's your record.
People's 55, Adam.
Thank you.
Obviously, you left that message just to harass Dan and Linda, correct?
No, incorrect. That was a call to my children. They were not home. I surmised they were not home, and I reached Linda, the office girl's name on the machine, which shouldn't have been there. It was a call to my kids. But I
Okay.
knew if the kids weren't there and I kept calling back, it would harass him that I was calling. I wasn't calling to harass him.
Well, okay, you said there at the end, I'll call back later just to
Right.
harass you.
Well, I
You didn't
called
say-
back to reach the kids, but I knew if I had to call a few times before the kids got there, that it would be bothersome to him. But how would I know when the kids would be there?
I am having so much fun. I love this machine. You suckers, you. Anyway, you remember how your favorite case was going to court, the guy went to court to prove the other guy was an asshole and he won? I want to go to court to prove you're and I'll win. I love it. This is going to be so much fun.
Now that was a call that was intended to harass them, correct?
I never picked up the phone to call Dan Broderick to harass him. I called to reach my children. If I got the machine, I would be mad and harassed, and I would say ugly things to him.
You said this is so much fun. You were having fun?
Obviously,
Leaving those
I wasn't
messages?
having fun, but I knew that he would take the messages and tape them and use them against me because that's what he was doing.
You knew that these messages were harassing, correct? You knew that it was harassing.
I didn't call to harass.
Okay, I know that was a pretty long trial video. There's a lot of videos that I had found, so I'm going to go through them and I'm going to post them here and there, but I'm also going to go a little more in depth on their relationship, how it ended, what happened with the affair, and everything. So stay tuned for that. And don't worry, I'm not going to give up on Doherty Dozen. I'm just spicing the channel up a little bit, just something new. But I'm not going to stop snarking with the Doherty Dozen, so don't worry about that. Let me know what you guys think. If you guys have either seen the Lifetime movie with Meredith Baxter, I believe, or that Netflix series that came out, I want to say a year or two ago. Let me know. You guys have a good rest of your day. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye.